Namaste, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. Just as every week, I'm going to start this week also with a chant. And for this week, I've picked a chant written by Nai Swami Jyotish. He's the spiritual successor of Swami Kriyananda, and this is one of my favorite chants. And this chant came to me as I was meditating on this topic. We will also discuss why I picked this chant today and how it ties in with the topic that we are going to discuss. The words of this chant are very simple. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. So please join along, sing with me, or tune into these words and the melody of this chant. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Let's now meditate briefly on that melody and the words of that chant. So friends, We have been discussing the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and this week I'm going to move on to chapter 14. Actually, the chapter 14 and the ideas we are going to discuss are closely tied with what we discussed last week. We looked at the idea of Prakriti and Purusha, spirit and nature, the dance between the two of them, and how all of creation is a manifestation of that. And in 14th chapter, Krishna focuses specifically on just one topic, the three gunas, or the three qualities or the three essential modes of nature. I don't know how the word mode comes from, or what does it really mean, but oftentimes I've seen the word guna translated as that. We'll anyway discuss more about that in this particular class. This entire chapter is an exposition on the three gunas, or the qualities through which Prakriti manifests. This entire creation manifests in these three aspects of nature. So the verse that I picked is the 9th verse of chapter 14. I'm going to read the verse for you, and I'll read the literal translation. We are, of course, going to discuss a few other verses from this chapter also. This is how the verse sounds in Sanskrit. Sattvam sukhe sanjayati rajaha karmani bharata jnana mavritya tu tamaha pramade sanjayatyuta. And now I'll read the English translation of this particular verse. Sattva attaches one to happiness, rajas to activity, and tamas, by stifling one's discrimination, submerges one in difficulties. I picked this verse because it almost sounds like the summary of this entire chapter, but we will touch upon ideas that are presented in the other verses as well. As I was just sharing a few seconds ago, the three gunas are often, qualities, and it's a concept that we often hear about on the spiritual path, not just specific to Yoganandaji's teachings, but in general, people often talk about them, and it's a very fundamental principle that is not only something that we want to understand, but it is so practical and applicable in our lives. So in today's webinar, I'm planning to share some of these practical ways in which we can apply and use this philosophy in our everyday life. Now, what are the three gunas? Like I was saying, these are the three qualities. Rather, I like to think of them as three expressions of energies through which Prakriti or nature manifests, through which creation itself comes into being. There is a great Indian scripture called Chandi Path, or the Devi Mahatmya, in which the process of creation itself is discussed in great detail. And it talks about how Divine Mother, this vibration of Om, when it first came into being, it split itself into these three qualities. And everything from there on came from these three qualities. These three are the essential energies that make up all of the manifested universe. Now, what are these three qualities? The three qualities, as you might have already heard, and if not, they are called Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas in the Sanskrit language. And in English, they are roughly translated as Sattva, Sattva refers to the uplifting or the purifying energy. Rajas refers to the activating energy or the outward energy, and tamas is the dulling or the darkening energy in nature. And nature itself is always a combination of these three. When I'm talking about nature, I don't just mean nature as in forests and mountains and stream. I'm talking about all of us, everything in creation. We are all a combination of these three gunas, and these exist in all of us. Now, I'm going to read a few other verses from the 14th chapter where Krishna actually defines these gunas for us. So let's start from there. I'm going to start with the 6th verse of chapter 14. I'm just going to read the English translation for you. O Arjuna, of these three gunas, the pure quality of Sattva bestows health and understanding, but still causes bondage to the body by making a man attached to happiness and intellectual knowledge. So this is what this quality of Sattva does. Now, moving on, the next verse, verse 7 of chapter 14. Know the quality of Rajas to be imbued with passion, which activates strong desires and attachments and binds one to the body. By intense expectation, it develops in him through his own restlessness. Again, it cannot be better explained. And the third quality, which is verse 8 of chapter 14, O Arjuna, know the darkening quality of tamas to produce ignorance, which deludes the mind and makes people lazy, heedlessly attached to subconscious sleep. So these three are the qualities. Now, what does that even mean when we talk about uplifting, activating, and darkening? I want to talk about why I picked this chant even to start with for this webinar, if the connection is not clear, because I love this one analogy that Swamiji gives in the book, which actually comes from Yoganandaji. Yoganandaji also has another beautiful chant called I Am the Bubble. I think I shared that with you a couple of weeks ago. Now, Yoganandaji often compared the ocean to spirit. And we are all waves on the ocean. We are all smaller expressions of that spirit, just rising up above it and then dissolving back into it. That is a beautiful image for us to contemplate on, and that's what this chant that I shared with you was also describing. Now, as Swami Kriyananda often used to tell us, Yogananda was an avatar, he was a realized being, and whoever knew him, if ever they were in his company or through, in physical presence or even through his vibration, through his books, one might think that he was the greatest human being that there was. And if you compare this analogy or apply this analogy of the spirit being pure ocean and all of us creatures, all the beings being waves on the ocean, you might be tempted to think that the greatest human being is the highest wave, the most glorious wave that is rising above the ocean. But Swamiji would often tell us it's quite the opposite. The greatest human being is the wave that does not even come out of the ocean. It is still a part of the spirit, and that's what Yogananda was. He was always totally identified with the ocean, that there was almost no wave at all. He dawned on a personality in order to interact with us, in order to live those 60 years that he did on this material plane, but he was never identified with it. His own sense of identity was never with the wave. He was the smallest wave that there ever was on the surface of the ocean. Now, I'm bringing up this analogy and talking about it with reference to the three gunas because these three qualities are qualities that separate us from spirit. One can think of tamas as the darkening or the dulling quality that is the most farther away from spirit, so it makes the waves rise the most from the ocean. And the activating or the rajas quality is that which is also separating one from spirit, but it's not as far as tamas. So it is a wave that is just slightly shorter than the tamasic wave. And then sattva is also one that separates us. Like Swamiji describes in that example, sattva makes us attached to happiness and knowledge, which are not bad things, which are wonderful things, but it again creates that separation of that wave from the ocean. So these three gunas are what separate us as beings from spirit. These are the gunas, these are the aspects of nature that cause the wave to rise. And the spiritual path is all about bringing the wave back to the ocean, shifting our own sense of identity from being the wave or the wavelet to going back to identifying as the spirit of the ocean itself. Now, the three qualities, of course, they manifest in us in so many different ways. Sattvic qualities, for all practical purposes, for the purpose of this particular webinar or in any spiritual setting, as much as the Bhagavad Gita tells us that Sattva makes us attached to happiness or knowledge, it is a quality that we want to be developing. We want to be working on Sattvic qualities while we are on this material plane, because that is the only way to neutralize and bring down the rajas and the tamas that are rising us farther above. Because as I said, we are all a combination of all three gunas. As long as we are still in these egos, we are not fully self-realized, we have tamas and rajas in us. Nobody is purely sattvic or nobody is purely rajasic. That's just not possible. We have all three gunas in us. And what are expressions of sattvic qualities? Well, to start with, even the practice of meditation is sattvic. Devotion is sattvic. Chanting is sattvic. Anything that is spiritually uplifting, anything that dissolves our sense of separateness of our ego, service is sattvic. Going to temples, practicing religious rituals, all of these are sattvic activities. Now, a fully realized being is above those definitions also. They're above these identifications that bind them to any guna, so they rise above the sattvic guna also. In the hymn to Guru that we often chant, the traditional hymn from India, there's this beautiful line where it says, Bhava titam triguna rahitam sadgurum tam namami. I bow to the Guru who is above and beyond all emotions and who has transcended all the three gunas. So the Guru, or that perfect expression of that pure Christ consciousness, of that divinity descending into matter, that Guru consciousness is above the three gunas, even above the sattvic guna. So for such a being that is fully realized, there is no identity with sattva either. But I'm going to say, just for practical purposes, assuming all of us that I'm speaking to are all students and practitioners on the spiritual path and not yet fully realized beings, we want to be affirming and cultivating sattvic qualities. That is the whole objective of the spiritual path. Now, what about the other two? Let me first talk about tamasic before going into rajas. Now, tamasic, again, it's not hard to recognize or to identify around us. Tamasic is a darkening or dulling quality, laziness, addictions, anything that numbs our mind, anything that makes us unconscious, anything that pushes us deeper and deeper into subconscious states. These are all tamasic in nature. It manifests all around us in our own lives. Even unclean settings, people who are very messy, it's because they are creating a lot of tamasic energy around them, because that's what they're reflecting from inside out. People who are not clean in their work, all those different things. People who are lazy, who do not want to work, who want to just take a free ride. All these are tamasic qualities that are within us. Now, the second quality, rajas, is one that has a lot of subtlety. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. Rajas, as we saw, is the activating quality. It is that pulls the ego out into outward activity. Now, there are a lot of gradations of rajasic activity. I want to start by saying that Paramahansa Yogananda ji said, this planet, the planet that we live on, it goes through many cycles called the yugas, but predominantly this is a rajasic planet. And he said there are planets and planes of existence that are purely tamasic or purely sattvic, but we just happen to be on a plane that is predominantly rajasic, which is activity driven. That is the nature of planet Earth itself. So there's a lot of various shades and gradations of how we manifest the rajasic quality. Now, rajasic is anything that makes us restless, anything that makes us seek something from the outside. And there are so many things that we seek on a daily basis, whether it's pursuit of money and wealth, pursuit of sexual pleasure, pursuit of any kind of sense fulfillment, the need or the greed to have more, the need to be recognized, the need to always seek for love, all those things that keep us going into the world again and again, looking for that fulfillment outside of ourselves. All of those things are rajasic in nature. But there are two primary kinds of gradations that we want to understand while we work with rajasic quality. That is the activating force that is activating but eventually uplifting. And the other is the activating force that is activating but eventually darkening or downward pulling. Master used to call this, Yogananda ji used to call this the Rajo Tamo Guna or the Rajo Sattva. These are both rajasic qualities, but one of them eventually will move us in the right direction and the other will eventually pull us down into the wrong direction. Like, for example, indulgence in pleasures, seeking of sexual pursuits or just any kind of fulfillment, overeating, seeking money for greedy, selfish reasons, always acting with that selfish motive in any situation. All of these are examples of Rajo Tamo Guna. So in the moment, we are activating the ego, we are channeling a lot of energy into the world to get what we want. But eventually, at the end of that cycle of that energy, where we are taken to is tamasic quality. Because at the end of the fulfillment of that pleasure, of that sense fulfillment, of having that money, wealth, all of that not only makes us restless, but also darkens our consciousness. So these are rajasic qualities we want to be avoiding. But there are also rajasic qualities that are eventually uplifting. For example, simply, engaging in outward service because it is the right thing to do, but not necessarily with the right attitude. Or trying to, chant the name of the Lord, even not with devotion, but simply because we want to do what everybody else is doing. I'm not giving great examples. I'm going to read a little bit from Yoganandaji's writings, but there are rajasic attributes and qualities that we can express and we can channel that might be ego activating, but eventually they take us in the right direction. Now, it is really important for us here to understand, as I've been saying a few times in the last 10 minutes, that these qualities are progressive in nature. One cannot work with tamas and directly transform it into sattva without going through that rajas. The wave cannot come from here to here. The wave has to come from here to here and gradually descend down into being sattvic and finally dissolving into the ocean. That's why I really, really like the analogy of the wave, and I shared that chant to begin this class. In that same way, if we are stuck in tamasic modes of being, then the only way for us to move towards sattva and to spiritual upliftment is to go through rajasic energy. There's this example that is quoted from the life of Swami Vivekananda. I haven't read this myself, but I've heard it in multiple occasions from different teachers, about how somebody approached Swami Vivekananda to live a spiritual life. He wanted to, I think, embrace some form of renunciation or devote himself to spiritual pursuits. And the advice that Swami Vivekananda gave him was a rather interesting one. He said, how about you go into the world first and learn to lie and cheat and steal money, and once you're able to do that, come back to me, then we can talk about spirituality. Now it might seem so ironical and almost making no rational sense that a spiritual teacher as great as Swami Vivekananda asking a seeker to do, adharmic things that are against the law of nature. But the way it is interpreted, or at least if that is how that is what he really told this person, is this: Vivekananda was asking him to first shift that tamasic energy into ego-based seeking, so he can learn to move that energy, because this person already had a very dull consciousness. He had no habit or experience in putting energy out. If such a person was going to embrace meditation or some kind of spiritual living, that darkened quality of the mind will make them passive and static. It will not necessarily uplift them. They first have to move energy so that darkening, dulling quality of tamas can be transmuted. It can be made to move, and then gradually that rajas can be transformed into sattva. So Vivekananda was asking him to first move that energy, do something for yourself, act out of ego, but first learn to act. Then you can go into that eventual state of inaction, as Krishna earlier talked about in another chapter, because that state of spiritual inaction, of being not engaged in the world and being completely absorbed in one's own divine self within, that does not come from passivity. One has to learn how to channel and transmute energy before being able to go to that state. So it is important for us to understand that there is a lot of value for rajasic qualities in our own life. Now, Yoganandaji gave what is called a psychological chart. That's what I want to share with you before I end this webinar. I think this was one of the earliest things that Yoganandaji created. It is often used a lot in Education for Life, which is a system of education for children based on Yoganandaji's teachings. And of course, all of us are learning and growing, and we are spiritual children in some way. So these principles are very, very useful and applicable. It is the principle of how we recognize these three modes within ourselves, and we learn to gradually transcend or shift the tamasic qualities into their next step. So, of course, all the tamasic qualities are rather pretty, they're obvious. Like, I'm going to just read a few examples. The chart is very big. I've shared the link for this chart, an abridged version of this chart in the link in the webinar description itself, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. So you'll be able to look at it from there. I'll give you some examples of tamasic qualities: careless, negligent, deceiving, procrastinatory, callous, dull, stupid. All these are tamasic qualities. Crooked, lustful, covetous. It's all pretty obvious things that darken our consciousness. Now he goes on to say, he talks about rajasic qualities that eventually lead to tamas, rajotamo qualities. Now this is where it's important for us to distinguish rajas into these two categories so we know what we are working with. Some of the examples of rajotamo qualities are having egotistical love, fidgety, imitative, revengeful, arrogant, disrespectful. Now, see, things like arrogant, Yoganandaji does not qualify as tamas or tamoguna or darkening, because there's a lot of energy that it takes to be arrogant and disrespectful. So whoever is being that way has learned to work with energy, but eventually the cycle is going to darken or dull their consciousness. Although it is a rajasic quality, it will eventually cause their downfall. And then he goes on, he gives a lot more examples. Turbulent, proud, thoughtlessly accepting, showing partiality, untruthful out of impulse, and many examples like that. Now, the more important one, which I think is practically applicable for a lot of us, the Rajo Sattva qualities, things that are activating our ego but will eventually lead us in the right direction. What are those? Lip sympathy without deep feeling. Even expressing, saying sorry even if you don't mean it, or thank you even if you don't mean it, the fact that you do it will eventually give you an experience of what it means to say sorry or thank you while meaning it. Moral reason, reasoning itself, having a sense of ought. People who say, you cannot do that, you shouldn't do that, that is not right, this is not. They have a sense of what is right. They might be attached to it through their ego and maybe applying it in a rigid way. But just that sense and the desire to want to do the right will eventually be able to transcend their tamasic qualities. And he goes on, he gives many examples like that. Sharp but shy, sensitive, kind-hearted but dull and simple. Prompt in forming resolutions is one of my favorites. Prompt in forming resolutions at the slightest encouragement, but not persistent in carrying them out. That will, that desire in us that says yes, but somehow we are not able to stick through it. Even though that's not necessarily the best of virtues, it is a good quality. Eventually, it will take you to that place where you learn to say yes, but also you are able to sustain that flow of energy to follow through. So, these are all qualities that we work with. The entire psychological chart that Yoganandaji created is based on the gunas, and these are things that we can apply in life. I've often led exercises or participated in activities where we go through these charts and identify what are the qualities that are present in us and how we can work with them. It even gives us a great amount of self-awareness through introspection, which can be very helpful in being able to work with these gunas. And there are so many ways. These gunas can be applied in all aspects of life, because everything in nature is consisted of the three gunas, as we have been discussing so far. Even something as simple as food. People often say, what foods are sattvic, what is rajasic, what is tamasic. Like, for example, it is said that anything that is white in color, like, all-purpose flour or white rice, anything, potatoes, starchy and heavy, all these things are tamasic in nature. What is rajasic? Sugar, anything that is sweet and perky, things that are spicy, these all activate, they make you restless and act in the world. They are rajasic. And what is sattvic? Greens and raw vegetables and fruits. These are, of course, sattvic because they purify and make us calmer and deep. Now, it's interesting I picked that example because there's something for us to note there. Like I was saying, it is all a progression, and we are all a combination of these three gunas. We cannot say that I'm never going to eat white rice. There is going to be white rice in our meals. There is going to be a little bit of sugar. There's going to be a little bit of spice. And then there's going to be raw vegetables and fruits and all of that. We are trying to shift and predominantly move towards sattva by including more raw foods in our diet and reducing the amount of tamasic and rajasic foods. It is not to say that I'm going to become a fruitarian. If that is right for you, great. But we are all working in the world, and we have our dharma that is tying us to a lot of material activities. So it is not necessary that we completely shy away or form these rigid rules of what we can and cannot do, but rather we learn to gradually recognize those tamasic and rajotamo gunas within us, and we learn to gradually lift them up. So the whole discussion on the gunas can go on forever, and there are so many practical applications to it. Maybe I'll do a more detailed video of how we can work with them and some more practical tips and experiences on that. But I think it is time for me to end today's webinar. I'll see you all next week with another verse of the Bhagavad Gita. Until then, God bless you all.